This is a special episode of Startup Podcast in partnership with Philippine Startup Week 2021. For this episode, once again, we have the Head of Marketing and Communications at IdeaSpace Philippines and QBO Innovation Hub, Eunice Braga. And we will answer a very important question. Ano nga ba ang startup? So, hello Eunice, thank you once again for having this conversation with this podcast.
Yes.
So, sagutin natin ang tanong. So, ano nga ba ang startup?
Yeah. I think startups are defined first by, I think largely the technology that they use, but also what makes them unique is really the ability to scale and grow exponentially. So I don't think there's any one definition, but people tend to see startups as like tech-driven, very scalable business model and like high growth ambition. So I think those three things would be parang the key ingredients of what makes a startup.
Okay, actually, in my view, parang ang keyword din sa is yung pagiging new. Kumbaga, may something new basically. Or like may innovation na you try to put into reality and somehow to make it into mainstream. Parang yung mainstream part yun yung parang magiging scalable siya and gumagana nga or validated nga yung parang model on how it works. Is it right?
Yeah, I think yung new part of it, medyo sina-challenge siya ngayon.
Okay.
Kasi syempre, nakakita na rin natin na there are startups that are built on like applied uses of like existing technology. For example, so like I didn't invent AI, or like there are other startups, they didn't invent AI, pero they're building off.
Okay.
They're building off AI, for example, or augmented reality, is what we're seeing now with all of these conversations about like the metaverse. So I think in the earlier days when parang bago pa lang ang mga startups, parang there was more of a premium of it has to be new. But I think now na yun nga, parang ang dami nating nakikitang applications of like existing technologies or relatively new technologies. Parang even that focus of like it has to be new is parang rather challenged. Parang hindi siya as big of a requirement as maybe it was previously. Maybe in areas like deep tech, where you really need technology for it to exist, new technology for it to exist, parang nandun pa rin yung premium on there has to be something new about it. But parang if I look at parang what I'm also seeing like in the ecosystem and in conversations in other ecosystem, like the new part isn't as valuable as it used to be.
Yeah, so I think yung technology, kasi technology actually ang basic definition is the combination of previous methods or practices or materials or skills. Yeah. So I want to ask naman ngayon, so meron tayong idea sa startup, although somehow it can be vague, it can be unclear talaga. Pero bakit kaya hot or parang bakit ba trending medyo ang startups ngayon sa Pilipinas?
I think definitely factor yung recent races ng mga startups, especially over the past year. Kasi halos sunod-sunod sila eh. So you had Great Deals, Quickwire, Kumu, Mad Eats, Cloud Eats, InvestEd, One Export. All of these different startups have raised significant amounts of money over the past year. Of course, I'm not gonna forget Yield Guild Games. The first startup that Anderson Horowitz invested in, and they're actually like the same investors behind some of the largest tech companies that we have now. So I think definitely yung reason why it's hot is like factor tong mga races na to kasi people are starting to see na hey, like Filipino startups are becoming more investment worthy, they're growing, and they're capturing the attention not just of local investors but foreign investors as well. I think the other thing is, and this is maybe where timing works a bit in our favor, yung shift talaga to digital products and services na nangyari over the past few months because of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's actually a study that Google made on it na parang yung adoption ng digital products and services, like tumaas talaga siya noong 2020 because of the pandemic. And parang naging forcing function pa nga yung pandemic para mapilitan yung mga tao na, sige, magbayad na tayo online, mag-online banking tayo, gumamit tayo ng apps like Coins or GCash or Paymaya. And naging mas widely accepted siya to people. Whereas, maybe even like as late as 2019, kung pumunta akong sari-sari store, sinabihan mo si ate or si kuya na magbabayad po ako via GCash, baka hindi pa nila tanggapin yun. Kahit pera siya. So I think the pandemic is definitely pushed parang yung use of like digital products and services. So I think people are more open to like learning about startups and maybe hearing about what tech startups can do for their business or their industry or their community compared to previous years. And then I think the other thing na naman is yung government and private sector efforts which have been happening for at least over a decade now. So it's not entirely a new thing, pero itong nakikita nating growth ng startup ecosystem ay nilatag to at least a decade or so ago, starting from pushing yung malawakang adoption ng internet, and then yung learning from other startup ecosystems and bringing parang certain structures here, like create ng mga startup incubators and accelerators. And then from the government side of things naman, laws like the Innovative Startup Act, which has already been signed, and then yung implementation nun has already built a foundation for the Philippine startup ecosystem. So yung nakikita natin ngayon ay yung bunga na ng mga bagay na naitanim years before.
And siguro idagdag ko lang kasi ang napapansin ko on the side naman of like students of like parang merong hunger to solve problems.
Yes.
Yeah. And then yun nga with the opportunities na pinaprovide ng government and ng other institutions, parang mas nagkakaroon ng way kumbaga para to turn that problem solving into reality.
I think also nandito na tayo sa point na it's cheaper and quote-unquote easier. I'll qualify bakit ko sinasabi quote-unquote easier to start than ever before. Internet costs are cheaper. I mean, they could still be cheaper, but internet costs are cheaper compared to maybe like the early 2000s. Mas accessible na rin ang mga devices compared to, again, 20 years ago, in the early 2000s or even in the 1990s where hindi naman lahat ng tao may personal computer even. And then I think yung learning aspect din. If you want to learn how to code, you can even get started on YouTube. Yeah. Parang you don't even have to pay for like a 4-year degree or something. Or parang if gusto mo talaga to be in a business setting kagad, maybe you can even intern or apprentice for a startup. And may mga startups na rin kagaya ng like Avion School where they offer that kind of education for like a study now, pay later arrangement. So yung technology education costs are a bit lower than they were maybe 20, 30 years ago. Information is made more accessible thanks to social media and things like free Wi-Fi. So it's also easier to start. I also think about things like yung no-code and low-code movement where you don't even really need to learn how to code to produce like an early version of your startup or your product or your service. So yun. So yung pagsasama-sama na itong different factors na to, I think yung nag-raise ng interest sa mga tao and are bringing more people into this space and more people into the startup scene.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting kasi like for me, in a philosophical point of view, like andyan na yung tools, andyan na yung knowledge, parang nagiging accessible and nag-iiba yung parang culture. Like for example, pag pinanganak ka ngayon, pag may bagong isinilang ngayon, ibang-iba yung surroundings niya. Like may smartphone na siya, bata pa. May access na to coding, probably bata pa, like 5 years old, 6 years old. They can develop apps, they can start to solve problems. So I think it's also like a different, like a different background overall. So also, you mentioned about mas nagiging accessible or mas nagiging easier somehow yung pag-start ng startup. And I think isa sa mga nagko-contribute dito is yung incubators and accelerator program. So, can we know more about like ano ba ang incubation and acceleration? And like why are there programs like this? Like yung ginagawa nga ng QBO and ng IdeaSpace?
Yeah. So, incubation and acceleration, really the overarching goal is really to help startups grow and scale. So incubation technique generally for earlier stage startups, so idea early stage startups, and then acceleration is really for those that are a bit further along na in their startup journey. May mga kliyente na gusto na mag-grow, gusto na mag-scale. So pero yung objective nila parehas is the same. It's really to support founders and their startups as they go on this journey, help them grow, provide them with resources, mentors, parang frameworks, so they can actually turn their idea into stable, scalable, sustainable business. So yun naman yung pinaka-end goal, is that na mabuhay siya at magtagal siya in the long run.
Yeah, so basically like incubation and acceleration, sila yung mas nagpa-provide pa ng tools and bringing them mismo sa mga tao, kumbaga. And now let's talk about investors kasi we always hear na startups get investments, ganyan. So siguro question is, first, why would a startup want an investor? And maybe second question, why would an investor want to invest?
Yeah, I think why would startups want an investor? Usually the answer to that is because nakikita na nila na they would need not just the money, but also potentially the expertise ng investor, yung network ng investor, and then yung knowledge ng investor to succeed. So it's never just about the money. If you're really looking for an investor that's a good fit for you, parang you would look for a combination of these things: money, expertise, connections or network, and then knowledge. So yun. So access to those things parang would be why startups would want an investor. And then also there's also like an opportunity to speed up yung growth and scaling when you get cash infusions or support from investors. Parang the more mature, the more savvy investors might have additional like knowledge in your specific industry that would allow you to grow. So, depende, iba-iba yung motivation, syempre depende sa founders. Pero yun yung general reasons why maghahanap ang isang startup ng investor.
How about on the investor side? So, bakit naman siya mag-i-invest sa startup?
Syempre yung pinaka-basic is like I invest with the goal of earning from that investment in the future. Profit-oriented naman siya. There are investors that are maybe not as profit-oriented as they are impact-oriented. So they call them impact investors. But generally, it's profit and then also impact. And then if they're an investor with a very specialized portfolio, yung talagang nag-i-invest sila in certain industries, then it's really for them to have presence in a certain market or a certain area, for example. So there are also different motivations for why investors would want to invest as well.
And siguro parang enabling somehow yung mga startups, yung mga founders with the currently na nandun na sa industry or nasa ecosystem. Parang somehow nag-flow yung energy or money, or hindi lang kasi money nga yung knowledge, yung tools, methods, etc. And isa pa sa mga lagi ko naririnig kasi lagi din binabanggit na investors or some programs would want for the startup to have an MVP before they invest or before they accept in the program. So ano ba yung MVP? We always hear that.
So yung MVP is minimum viable product. So it's actually the pinaka-basic na version of the product or service that you want to offer to the world. And honestly, it can be as crude or as basic, quote-unquote, as you want. I've heard from founders na parang yung version nila ng MVP ay isang Excel sheet.
Okay.
Or isang Google Sheet. Pero natetest na nila kung like may market ba for what they want to offer. Like, malaki ba yung market na pwede nilang gawing negosyo yung idea nila. So these are the things that you are trying to figure out kasi at the MVP stage na gaano ba kalaki yung market ko, may mga tao bang gustong bumili ng bagay na gusto kong ibenta or ng serbisyo na gusto kong ibenta, ano yung price point, kung saan sila bibili, ano yung challenges nila. So you can do that with really something as basic as an Excel sheet. And parang the good thing is marami na rin mga no-code or low-code tools. So pwede ka actually gumawa ng app. If I'm not mistaken, meron ng service na pwede kang gumawa ng app from an Airtable table. So, mas madali mong natetest yung mga questions mo or yung mga assumptions mo. And this is really a very crucial stage for the startup. Kasi once you get to like the MVP, you start to get real world data.
Actually, yeah. Kasi I think isa sa mga napapansin ko when I interview other startup founders, they always mention, lalo na yung mga medyo matagal na like 5 years, 6 years, they always mention evolution or evolve.
Yes.
Kasi when you start a startup, it will evolve pa many times. And ang mahalaga nga is yung feedback kumbaga ng customers kasi but when you have an MVP out there, maybe when you have a product na kahit gaano pa kasimple yan, and customers or potential clients or users will react to it and say, ito yung kailangan namin, ito yung pwede pang gawin. That's really the start, right? Of the product development, of the evolution. And then one thing, sure, go.
Yeah, sorry. Kasi syempre yung gusto nating i-avoid ay yung maglalabas ka lang ng idea to the world.
Okay, yeah.
Hindi mo kino-consider ano yung problem na sinasolve ko. Sino yung mga taong gusto kong matulungan with this idea or with this solution. Sa papaanong paraan ko sila matutulungan. And like, bakit ako as opposed to another business or another solution. So yun. So the MVP really will help you start to answer those questions. And then mo realize na, parang baka hindi pala ito dapat yung problem na sinosolve ko or baka kulang pa ako sa information from my customer or baka ito pala yung gusto ng customer, hindi yung iniisip ko. So baka ito yung mas problema na kailangan i-solve or mas nawawalan si customer ng pera dito sa problema na to. So baka ito yung mas gusto kong pagtuunan ng pansin. So yun nga, like you said, ang startup talaga, dumadaan talaga siya sa maraming evolution at maraming pivot. Yung unang idea mo will not be the final form.
Yeah,
it will be the present form. Pero it will not be the final form of your startup. And even then, like for example, nakita naman natin yan sa mga tech companies na kagaya ng Google, for example, na nag-start bilang search engine. Ngayon, hindi na lang sila search engine. May advertising platform na lang sila with Google Ads. Platform na lang sila for creators with things like Google Podcast and YouTube. So, nag-evolve talaga siya. And parang that evolution is really just a part of the process.
Yeah, and I think really ang kailangan mangyari dito is you really solve the problem. I mean,
Yes.
Go down really to the problem. Go into reality. Hindi lang yung parang idea nga or parang conceptualization. Parang you really go down to the people who need it and will use it.
Yes.
And then another thing lang na important then I think for startups to know and to learn is yung concept ng business models and value creation. So what does this mean? And like, kasi usually investors also find about this.
Oh, business model is basically answering the question, paano tayo kikita ng pera? So, may mga basic business models. So, there's business to consumer, diretso. So, a great example of this would be na non-tech. Para lang may madali tayong example na may tindihan. Must be like Jollibee.
Yeah.
Na diretso sa customer yung product. And then, there's also a business model na B2B. So business to business. So for example, good example to that, to use the Jollibee analogy is an example of a business to business model is yung mga nagbebenta ng produce ng chicken sa Jollibee.
Like the raw materials.
The raw materials, Ako ay business na nagbebenta sa isa pang business. Yeah. So yun. So there are different kinds of business model. So yun. So it's basically answering the question, paano ako kikita ng pera, kanino ako magbebenta. And yun, that's really the gist of it.
And I think kaya natin gusto kumita ng pera para ma-sustain yung operations.
Yes,
magawa yung business, magawa yung value. So speaking about that, so ano naman yung value? I mean, what really is value creation? I mean, what does it mean?
So, value creation is really, ano yung binabayaran ng iyong customer. So, again, going back to the Jollibee analogy, if we talk about ano yung value na create ng Jollibee, on the very basic level, it's the food that you serve. It's the chicken joy or the burger or whatever.
And the happiness that you provide.
Yeah, that's the second level, which is like, ano yung nakukuha ko na maybe not tangible from it.
Yes.
So for Jollibee, it would be like the happiness. For other kinds of businesses, maybe it's yung value na nakikreate mo for the customer would be time saved, money saved, improvement in processes, improvement in the product or service that your customer offers, better tracking. So yun, ganun. So parang I think yung magandang framework na dapat aralin ng sino man na gustong mag-start ng startup would be yung jobs to be done framework. Kasi dun, pag tinignan niyo yung sa jobs to be done framework, masasagot niyo yung parang, ano yung different things na mau-offer nitong product or service. Ano yung mga bagay na masasagot ko for the customer. Kasi parang hindi lang siya yung product or service itself, pero ano, for example, yung emotional jobs to be done na, na pag ginamit niyo yung produkto ko, ibig sabihin makakauwi kayo ng maaga. Or hindi mo kailangan mag-spend ng 8 hours on a certain task. 1 hour na lang. So, ibig sabihin, you have more of your life back or you have more of your time back. So, ultimately, value creation is like, what am I paying for as a customer? And then, ano yung outcomes na may expect ko after paying for this product or service?
Okay, I think that's a very good explanation and conceptual pag-share kung ano ba ang value creation. So, for our last question, kasi I always hear this, ano ang bootstrap?
Yes. Bootstrap, ibig sabihin, ay, in 2 words, sariling sikap. Yun siya in essence. So, bootstrap really means to self-fund your startup. So, iba-iba yung paraan ng pag-self-fund ng mga tao. So, may mga iba na humingi ng pera from friends and family, and that's how they get started. Yung iba naman, ginagamit yung sarili nilang savings para i-start yung startup. Meron ding ibang founders na nagtatrabaho sila habang tinatayo nila yung sariling startup. So, one example of a startup I remember is bago sila nag-pivot to their startup, dev shop sila. So gumagawa sila ng websites, apps for other companies. Tapos yung perang kinikita nila doon eventually became sort of like the seed money or yung panimula, pondo para sa sarili nilang startup. So yun. So it's really to fund your own startup without the help of an investor or without asking for a loan from a bank, for example.
And especially when you start getting revenues na nga, you use in your startup, you use that revenues to fund again. So magiging ikot na siya sa business model mo and sa startup mo. Okay, yeah, I think that's the most basic questions. I think I've asked the most basic questions, I guess, for newbies, startup founders, or for those people who want to go into the startup industry. So it's a very insightful, actually, even for me, conversation about startups. So let's just promote lang. So next week, we'll have this Philippine Startup Week nga. So can you share lang, can you invite our listeners?
Yes, so sa lahat po na nakikinig sa Startup Podcast, we hope that you can join us for Philippine Startup Week. It's happening November 15 to 19, 2021. So you can visit our website po, phstartupweek.com, and then also our Facebook page, Philippine Startup Week 2021, or our LinkedIn page, which is Philippine Startup Week. To get more information, get your tickets now. It's 100% free. And then also, if you want to learn more about these startup basics, even after Philippine Startup Week, please follow QBO Innovation Hub. That's QBO Innovation Hub. We actually regularly run a series of public education events called Basics. So we cover things from Startup 101, which is actually itong mga bagay na pinag-usapan natin ngayon. We also do business model canvas. So you can learn more about how to develop your own business model and sources of value. And then also things like pitching. So yun. So, but yeah, yung pinaka easiest way after listening to this podcast to learn more about these startup basics is sa Philippine Startup Week talaga. So make sure to get your tickets now.
Yeah, get your tickets now, and it's happening next week or November 15 to 19.
Yes.
Okay, so I really think our listeners and many people will learn more about startups in this upcoming event. So thank you so much, Eunice. This is a very informative and insightful special episode talking about startups. So thank you for sharing with us your knowledge, and thank you for spending some time dito sa Startup Podcast.
Yes. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.